see you guys in the dark.
In Sydney, at Bradley's Head Fortification near Mossman, there are a number of 68-pounder guns that are mounted on a traversing platform that overlooks Sydney's harbor. It was a small defensive battery that we used to form a part of the original defense system of Sydney Harbor. The site has now become a heritage-listed war memorial recreational area. This fortification also consists of barracks and underground tunnels for ammo storage, shelter, and medical supply rooms. The original structure had been there since the mid-1800s, with upgrades occurring regularly until its decommission in 1934. During my Cub Scout days, our group would often go on field trips to places with historical significance such as this. It was a stormy, miserable day when we set off for Mossman. Our troop leader was a pretty strict and harsh man that never let anything like weather get in the way of an outing. I didn't particularly mind, though. I enjoy the rain and find it adds a special element to old, somber sites like abandoned war batteries. Being a New Zealander only made it easier again. I couldn't help but laugh at the Australians in my troop that were shivering under large coats, while I took a thin hooded jacket that I kept in my pack. Our bus pulled into the side of the road at the bottom of the hill near the site, and we began to file off one by one. I trudged out last, being quite new and not having many friends. I tended to hang back and keep my head down. The troop leader barked for me to put a jacket on, but I shook my head and said that I was fine. He mumbled under his breath before walking off, began to climb up the hill to fortification. It was a good thing that he did not force me, as I would need a jacket to dry on later. We set off up after him, single file, with me bringing up the rear. The lighting and the thunder were making everyone in line jump in fright. It was amusing to watch them all twitch in unison. The rain began to get heavier and heavier as we walked. The color of the surrounding environment washed out to a dull gray as a result. My ears began to fill with a dull, low hum, only occasionally broken by a loud thunderclap or overheard complaint made by one of the troop members. They all noticed it too. Many of them began to clap their ears in the vain attempt of them blocking it. It didn't take long to reach the fort, and we all split up into groups to go and have a look around. As I was put into a group with two other boys that I got along with fairly well, John and Michael. We simply did not know each other at all that well. The other groups made their way straight for the guns and began to climb on top of them, yelling and making a racket that distracted the troop leader. I wasn't interested in trying to look at the weaponry while people were climbing around on it, as I enjoy inspecting things up close to see how they were put together. I made my feelings clear to the other boys, and they agreed with me. I instead turned my attention to the stairs leading down to the now flooded barracks area. It didn't look at all inviting, but that just made me want to investigate even more. I began to make the way towards the stairs with the two boys in the group following reluctantly. Behind me, I could hear one of them muttering, "No way am I going down there." "Are you?" "No way, man," the other one replied. "Looks haunted or something." "Hey," I chuckled, although I was feeling a little nervous myself. The hum was getting worse the closer we got to the entrance of the tunnel. I shook my head vigorously to relieve the pressure on my ears, and it seemed to help a little. I looked behind to see the other two digging into their ears with their fingers. Strange. I couldn't imagine why this was happening. We were practically at sea level after all. I stopped at the entrance of the tunnel and peered inside. Something definitely felt off here. I could feel pressure radiating out of the tunnel as though the air pressure was triple that of what was outside. But it was not like a breeze or a wind. It was difficult to put into words. Whatever it was, it made John and Michael stay a few feet behind me. We were all silent. An eerie sound echoed its way through the mouth of the tunnel, its origin seemingly coming from somewhere inside. I took my flashlight out of my backstrap loop and turned it on. It flickered to life briefly before making a terrible high-pitched buzzing noise and beginning to vibrate slightly. The bulb began to glow intensely bright before going out with a loud pop. I gasped and then dropped it. It was brand new, with new batteries, and the same make as the other issued flashlights that we all had received when we joined the Cub Scouts. The flashlight fell into a 5-inch deep puddle that extended into the clearly flooded barracks entrance. It rolled around lazily and side to side under the water as I watched it, astonished at what had happened. "Don't go in there, man," John said finally. "Yeah," Michael agreed while nodding his head. "This place doesn't feel right." I turned to them and tried to keep a straight face. "It's fine. I don't think I can get far anyways," I said. I pointed at the puddle that my flashlight was in. "It slopes downhill, so it's only going to get deeper as I go in." Michael then turned on his flashlight and shone it past me into the darkened entranceway. I bent down and picked up my flashlight. It felt warm in my hand. I shook my head and slipped it back into the easy loop of my bag strap. "Useless junk," I muttered to myself, before looking up to see what Michael's flashlight had illuminated. As I had suspected, the floor of the barracks resembled a paddling pool filled with rusty-colored water. I called out hello, and it echoed for ages. I looked back to see Michael looking very uncomfortable. John laughed and picked up a nearby rock before hurling it through the entranceway. The rock splashed, and we all laughed. Michael looked as though he had started to relax. They both began to pick up rocks and throw them. I stepped back so that I wouldn't get hit, and searched around for my own rock to throw. I then remembered what I had found, a few rocks that I kept in my pack, as my mother was a geologist, and liked me bringing them home from bushwalks. These were ones that Mom had deemed unusable, or already had, and I simply hadn't taken them out yet. I swung my pack around to the front, and opened the front pocket, diving my hand in, grabbing the first thing that I found, and flinging my arms up and back before hurling it as hard as I could into the tunnel. "Oh no," I thought, fear coming on rapidly as I realized that I had just thrown my house keys instead of a rock. I heard an audible thud of the keys hitting a wall before a couple of loud splashes straight afterwards. The key rang with a large gemstone that my mother had given me, and it only had 2 small keys on it that were dwarfed by the stone. Ironically, this large stone was given to me in an attempt to get me to stop losing my keys. This was the 3rd set that I had been cut for me since moving to Australia, and was told that it was to be my last or I would be grounded. I couldn't leave without them. "Michael," I yelled over the now howling wind. He and John stopped throwing rocks to look at me. I could hear the troop leader yelling to round us up as the weather was only getting worse, the thunder and lightning becoming more frequent with every passing minute. "Give me your light," I yelled, stepping towards him with my arm outstretched. He handed it over, and I turned around to walk back towards the entrance. "What are you doing?" They both had asked me at the same time. I didn't turn around, but just yelled back, "I threw my damn keys in there." I did not hesitate long before stepping inside. The water instantly soaked my shoes and socks. The noise from the storm and wind died down to about 10% of its original volume. I shivered and peered around with the beam of the flashlight, looking for a glint of the gemstone or my keys. I shuffled further inside, not wanting to take steps, as splashing would drench the rest of my clothes more. The noise from outside was almost non-existent now, with the dull hum and pressure now returning worse than ever. I cussed loudly and bent down to run my hands through the water as I stepped further and further inside. The flashlight began to blink and dim momentarily every few minutes before coming back to life. I began to become frantic, wanting to just get my keys and get out as soon as I could. I walked in quite deeply at this point, not having to round a corner before the flashlight suddenly turned off. My eyes now adjusted to its light meant that it was now pitch black. I cussed louder, this time, and turned the flashlight off and on. Nothing. The pressure on my ears increased again, and I doubled over in pain, holding my ears with both of my hands and wincing in pain. I could hear my pulse thumping in my ear canal, getting louder and louder, faster and faster, until it all of a sudden stopped. I let my hands off of my ears and let out a few trembling breaths before I heard it. Right in my ear, a whisper, but loud enough to be easily discernible. "Hello?" And then my foot was grabbed harshly by an unseen force. It felt like being in a vice. It felt like it had claws. Its power and force was so frightening, I couldn't move at all, and a coldness began to creep up the captive leg. Before I could even yell out, I fell, and my ankle twisted. The water was so cold, unnaturally cold, as if it should have been frozen. I'll never forget that feeling. I had been walking through it before, and it had not been this cold. I was half submerged and came up spluttering. As I raised my head, I heard the same voice from before echo softly. "Hello?" The grip on my foot finally relaxed, and I struggled up to my feet, gripping my arms with my hands and shivering loudly. Half from fear and the other half from the cold. I turned around and made my way around the corner to the entrance of the tunnel as fast as I could with my now sprained ankle. I could have sworn that I felt a slight push on my back as I hastily exited. I turned around to look and gasped when I saw my house keys in the spot where I had dropped my flashlight earlier. I had seen them sail out of my hand and heard them hit a wall inside the barracks. How could they have possibly ended up back here? This was still stagnant water that, if anything, was flowing into it, and not out of the barracks. I looked up one more time into the dark void of the tunnel entrance and bent down to scoop my keys from the water. John and Michael hurried over to ask what had happened, putting their arms around me and helping me back to the rest of the troop. "Just don't go in there," I replied shakily. "We told you not to," John replied, his voice sympathetic. Michael stayed silent, but helped me down the hill to the bus where the remainder of our troop was congregated. The troop leader asked us where we had been and why I was limping. I just shook my head and told him that I was fine. He ushered us into the bus, and we left the area bound for home. I was still shivering. I felt numb emotionally, though, completely unable to process what had just happened. Luckily, I had a dry jacket in my pack. As I took it off, I noticed that my flashlight looked as though it had been burnt in a couple of spots. After retrieving my jacket and putting it on, I took the flashlight out to examine it more closely. I turned it over in my hand slowly, holding my breath in terror at what I was observing. The flashlight had a handprint, complete with fingers too, seemingly burnt into the plastic handle. I showed it to John, who was sitting next to me, and he encouraged me to throw it away as it was broken into 2 pieces from the fall in the tunnel. I asked him if he could see the handprint, but he refused to look. I decided to keep the entire experience to myself after that. Until now. This makes no sense to me. This fort was never involved in conflict. No one died there. It wasn't even in use during the last World War. What the hell could it have been? Before you hear this story, I just want to say that it does not have a particularly satisfying climax or an ending. It defies all logic and sense, and will probably leave you feeling quite bewildered as it did to me while it occurred. Having said that, it's still the creepiest series of events that have ever happened to me. When I was a young teenager, my friend Nathan and I would often take my family's large sea kayak out across the nearby river to a small creek that was around half a kilometer away and shot off adjacent to an abandoned golf course. This creek was very slow-moving compared to the large Hawkesbury River, and as a result of this, a lot of rubbish and debris would collect in the mouth of the creek before slowing being distributed throughout its length. Nathan and I spent a lot of time at this creek. We even built a small jetty to tie the kayak to using long sticks and baling twine from the hay bales that we used to feed the horses back at home. We used this jetty to moor the kayak, while we navigated the mess of prickly paracacti that guarded the borders of the golf course. The golf course itself was incredibly eerie. No animals, birds, or even insects would be heard or seen on it. Even noise that you made was echoed back at you from a nearby sandstone cliff face. The closest thing that we saw to an animal was the skeleton of a kangaroo, which we found around the second time that we went there. It was strange, as we had only been to that spot around a week or so prior, and there was no corpse whatsoever. Yet there, in the middle of the clearing, was a full kangaroo. Skeleton, sun-bleached, and scattered about. We picked up some of the bones and admired them, remarking on what part of the skeleton we thought the bone was before tossing them aside. It took the skull back with me in the kayak and placed it on the bookshelf in my room when I got home that afternoon. I often took things back from outings. Nathan never did, but he was always on the lookout for things for me to collect. The next time that we went out to the creek, we decided to try our luck at exploring the waterway as far down as we could. We armed ourselves with machetes and a small hatchet that we had used when we built the jetty and set off. The journey was made extremely difficult by vines that spanned the creek from bank to bank, sunken logs, and dense river weed that made paddling nearly impossible. The water was full of garbage too. Broken tubes, life jackets, boat propellers, you name it. It all had made its way there. As we made it through a relatively rubbish-free area that had dark, ominous-looking water, I looked down briefly and saw what I thought was a doll's head. Just below the surface of the water, I stopped paddling to crane my neck to see it more clearly. It was definitely a doll's head. Around a foot below the surface, as if it was tethered there from the riverbed. It was looking up with a blank expression and light blue eyes. I instantly got panicked, feeling as I gazed at it. Before I could say anything, Nathan exclaimed, "Oh, cool," and plunged his hand into the water. I could tell that he was surprised how deep he had to reach to wrap his fingers around the head. But Nathan was a determined dude. He lifted the head out of the water and looked at me, grinning, streams of water running from his closed fist as he held it out towards me. I took it reluctantly from him. It was a small doll's head, around 3 inches in diameter. The head was clearly sun-damaged, and as a result, it had lost a lot of the paint features. There were no discernible pupils on the eyes, just the blue-colored irises. This gave the thing a really disturbing look. I shook my head at Nathan and placed the head on the front of the kayak to look like the figurehead of an old wooden ship. Nathan laughed. "Let's call him Bob," and he said while still grinning. I gave him a deadpan look, trying not to laugh. "You're so original," I scoffed at him, before turning around to resume paddling. I stopped immediately when I saw Bob staring straight back at me. I had not placed him like that. I had him placed facing outward. I knew that I had because his face creeped me out, and I did not want to look at it. Nathan was paddling while I had stopped, so we were moving at a good pace. As I was at the front of the boat, I was meant to keep an eye out for obstacles and call out if I saw anything ahead. I was entirely focused on Bob, however, as we struck a submerged tree and came to an abrupt stop. Everything on the kayak jumped forward as a result of this. Nathan, me, our packed lunches, and water bottles. Nothing too major happened. Everything on the kayak had jumped forward, that is, except for the doll's head. I had kept my eye on it the entire time, and did not move even an inch. It was like it was superglued to that boat. Nathan began teasing me about being blind, and I snapped at him to be quiet. He asked what was wrong, and I leaned to the right for him to see the head. I pointed and said, "It didn't move, dude." While half chuckling, Nathan moved forward to look at it closer. "What do you mean?" he asked. I picked up the paddle and took a slow stroke backwards into the water to slightly hit the tree again. Once again, everything on the kayak jumped forward slightly as we struck the tree, except for Bob. He stayed perfectly still. Nathan laughed. "That's weird," he said, his voice trailing off. I reached out to turn Bob around to his spot, and he turned easily. "Let's go home," I said loudly, trying to wash the area of the heavy feeling that was seeming to settle down upon us. Nathan agreed, and we turned the kayak around to head home. I watched the head like a hawk. Bob never looked back at me on the trip home, though. When we got home, we packed everything that we could into our backpacks and lifted the kayak out of the water. The head was stuffed into my pocket. I had not told Nathan about how creeped out I was out of fear that he would give me shit, or give him possible ammunition to play a dumb trick on me. Nathan was, and still is, my best friend, and he could absolutely have done that. If I had told him just as I would to him, the roles had been reversed. I decided to just keep my mouth shut about the stupid doll head, and hope that Nathan would simply forget all about it. We trudged over my neighbor's backyard with the kayak, holding it by the handles at both ends. My pocket started to feel very warm. I stopped listening to Nathan's nonsense, and began to focus more on the ever-increasing temperature of the head inside my pocket. Each time I thought, it can't get any hotter, it somehow would. It was not burning, more like the feeling of deep heat as it gets left on. I tried my best to ignore it. It was getting dark now, and I really wanted to get home. We dropped the kayak in the garage and put away the machetes and hatchet before making our way upstairs for dinner. I took a detour to my room to dump the head out of my pocket and onto my bed, leaving it there while I left my room to join Nathan and my family for dinner. Later on that night, the head was absent from my bottom bunk bed. Granted, my room was a mess, but it still should have been in the cleared spot on my bared mattress. I took a little time to look for it, tossing the blankets and sheets aside, climbing on top to peer down through the gap between the bed and the wall. I could not see it anymore. I was not concerned that I may not see it again. In fact, I was somewhat relieved that it was gone. However, I had a gnawing feeling that it was still around, not watching me exactly, but just a presence. Nathan seemed to have forgotten about it, though. He never brought Bob back up again that night, and he climbed up to the top bunk and promptly fell asleep. I lay down on my bed and pulled the bundle of blankets haphazardly over the top of me, falling asleep quickly as well. The next day I was awoken by the sounds of thumping noises coming from nearby outside. I got up out of bed to glance out of the window into the front paddock of the property to see my stepfather using the hatchet to hack away a tree stump that was much too large for the minuscule axe. My stepfather was a very smart man, but his grasp of common sense sometimes bordered on the absurd. I yawned, rubbing my eyes, and turning around before opening them, I froze in place. There on the shelf in front of the kangaroo skull was Bob, his eyes looking once again directly into mine. I turned to look at Nathan still sleeping on the top bunk, and instantly jumped up to the railing to punch him hard in the arm. He awoke with a pained cry and looked at me with a scowl. "What the hell, man?" Lifting his other arm to place his palm over the spot that I had just struck with the punch. "Like you don't know, you mofo," I said with a half-assed laugh, trying to mask the trembling tone in my voice. Nathan looked back at me. I stared at him to try to see if his stoic expression would falter. It always would when he played pranks on me. It did not, though. I shook my head and strafed across the railing so that the bookshelf was in his view. I pointed at the top shelf. "You didn't put it there?" I asked quietly. Nathan sat up to get a better look, and then shook his head. "Nah, man, I would have had him facing outward anyway. You know I would have." I spun my head around so fast that I'm surprised my neck did not break. Sure enough, the head was now facing towards the kangaroo skull, and not outward like before. I began shaking, unable to hold myself up on the railing any longer. I dropped to the floor and stormed over to the bookshelf to pick Bob up and took him into the kitchen. I stepped on the pedal to open the chrome bin in there and threw him in there a lot harder than I needed to. I did not let the lid naturally close, instead choosing to slam it shut as a good measure. Nathan sleepily trudged out of the room once I had finished doing all of this. He stared wide-eyed at the bin. He took a moment before looking up at me and speaking. "Yeah, that thing was creepy as hell, man." I was glad that Nathan agreed with me and was not using his opportunity to make fun of me. I nodded at him. Something about it was just wrong. Nathan playfully kicked the bin, making it rock a little. "Take that, creepy-ass doll-head guy," he exclaimed while laughing. I laughed too, feeling glad that the situation was over and dealt with. I asked Nathan again if he had actually put the head on the shelf, stating that if he had, it was okay. It was a good prank. I just needed to know for my own sanity. Nathan put his hand over his heart and sternly promised that he had not done it. I believed him then, and still do to this day, nearly 17 years later. Months went past. Nathan and I never had an opportunity to make our way back to the creek with school holidays approaching. I was keen to get big chores out of the way on weekends so that I could enjoy the full extent of the holiday period. I did this by working on weekends with my stepfather on various projects on our property. We used a machete and hatchet that Nathan and I had taken on our last trip to the creek in order to complete many of these tasks. Having no means to sharpen the tools, or even the knowledge for that matter, meant that the cutting and hacking got more difficult and cumbersome as time went on. One day, as I was fighting my way through a thicket of vines hanging from a large peppercorn tree, I observed my mother lean down to pick an object up out of the dirt in front of the paddock. It was in a spot directly below the main household wheelie bins that the council picked up weekly. I thought nothing of it. A few hours later, I went inside to get a drink of water and to change my shirt, as I had managed to create a large tear in the one that I was wearing. I entered my room and immediately felt strange. Feeling a need to look over at my bookshelf, the feeling of déjà vu was intense. Bob was back, staring at me again from the spot on the bookshelf that I had placed him on years earlier. This time, though, a small smirk was obvious on his features. I felt nausea sweep over me, and I turned around to walk into the kitchen. "Mom?" I asked sheepishly. My mother didn't look up from what she was doing. "Yes, honey," she replied. "Did you put something on my shelf?" Mom murmured in agreement with me. "Yes, I found that doll's head in the front yard earlier. I saw it in your room earlier in the year and figured you had lost it somehow. This made no sense to me. Mom could not have seen it in my room. There was no time for her to do it. Furthermore, what a bizarre thing to do. To find a doll's head underneath the retaining wall that our bin sat atop of, and think to wash it off and put it on my bookshelf. I shook my head and turned to walk back to my room, determined to get rid of him for good this time. I marched straight up to the bookshelf and reached up to grab Bob and paused. He was not there. I let out an exasperated sigh and began to violently push things aside on my bookshelf. First on the top bookshelf, then the second, all the way down until starting to fling things around in my room. He was nowhere to be found. I stopped and placed my hands on either side of my face and took a minute to slow my breathing down. I walked briskly out of my room and grabbed the cordless phone off of the wall. I called Nathan to tell him what had happened. After I finished rattling off a summary of what had happened, he was speechless about what I had told him. We both had no idea what to make of all of this. My stepfather, growing impatient with how long I was taking to come back, had returned to the house also, and was standing over me with his hands on his hips, looking very annoyed. I told Nathan I had to go, and hung up. My stepfather asked me where I had put the hatchet that I was using earlier. I looked confused. I had left it impaled into the impossibly large tree stump as always. He had watched me do it even. I told him as much, and he said that he could not find it. We both went back to the paddock together, and sure enough, just like Bob, the hatchet had seemingly disappeared. I never saw Bob again, but the story does not end there. Years later, when Nathan and I were in our 20s, we decided to take the kayak to make our way back to the creek for old time's sake. We took the kayak out of the garage and carried it up the road to the launch ramp as the neighbor's property that we used to get to the river had changed owners sometime a year back. It took us about an hour to get to the creek as opposed to our usual 20 minutes back in the day. When we arrived, we were very surprised to see that our jetty was still there, having survived 2 floods and over a decade of river tides. It honestly did not look like it was damaged in any way. Almost like new, we stopped and moored the kayak to it, as we always had done, and stepped out onto the shore. My foot kicked up something in the dirt, and I looked down to see the outline of a familiar shape. It couldn't be. I knelt down and grasped the handle of the object, pulling it out of the crumbled earth to reveal the hatchet that I had misplaced so many years ago. The casing bearing my father's monogram opposed into the dark leather. I shook my head. This was impossible. The hatchet was the only one we had purchased, and it was one of a kind. Nathan and I were the only ones that visited the spot out of my family, and anyone else that we knew. This made no sense whatsoever. Nathan looked at it quietly along with me, a heavy feeling seeming to settle around us once again. We both turned to look at the wide berth of still water at the mouth of the creek. In the center, the bloated and rotting corpse of a cow floating innocuously, drifting lazily in a clockwise direction. A storm was setting in rapidly. Nathan and I looked at each other at the same time and knew that this was the last time that we would ever be coming to Cata Creek. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.